talk to you today about one of the classic arguments for skepticism. It's an argument based on the idea of an infinite regress. Actually, there are two closely related arguments centering on that idea. One, the one that's really better known, is known as the problem of the criterion, and I'll talk about that separately. But today I want to talk about an argument that appears in Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, and also is the main argument stressed by Francisco Sanchez in his work That Nothing is Known. Sanchez is the classic academic skeptic who says, "Let this be my banner, that nothing is known." And that is really the focus of his book. He has a variety of arguments, but almost all of them take the form of this kind of classic infinite regress argument. So how does it go? We've looked at the general form of infinite regress arguments. And what Sanchez does is try to argue basically that the first premise of that classic argument is false. That was the simplest premise, the non-emptiness premise. We start with a class of things, let's say the class of things that are known, or if we're Pyronians, that are reasonably believed. And then, given that that's non-empty, we argue, aha, if something is reasonably believed, it must be for a reason, there must be a reason. If something is known, there must be a justification for it, etc. And then we say these justifications can't go on forever. We say that the reasons can't just go on forever. My reason is this, but why do I believe that? Well, my reason is this, but why do I believe that? That can't go on forever. And so we'd conclude that there must be something grounding knowledge or reasonable belief that is outside of that set, something else. But now Sanchez says, and Aristotle worries, wait, what if that's not possible? Now in the end, skepticism is not Aristotle's position, but he's focused on this argument and worried about it. Sanchez affirms the argument and says, yes, the idea that knowledge rests on something that is not knowledge, or that reasonable belief rests on something other than reasonable belief, is absurd. And so he concludes, nothing is known, nothing is reasonably believed. So here's how Sanchez argues. This is the argument for skepticism based on the idea of an infinite regress. And so Sanchez, at least, puts it this way. He says, first of all, knowledge can't rest on what isn't known. That's just the negation of the conclusion of the general form of an infinite regress argument. Look, there can't be something outside that is in some sense a first knowledge, a basic knowledge, a foundation of knowledge. It's not knowledge at all. Knowledge can't rest on what isn't known. Second premise is what I call the seriality premise, and it's still true. We can say knowledge requires justification. Third, justification has to be finite, it can't go on forever. And now conclusion is just the negation of that first premise. Therefore, well, the class of knowledge is empty. Nothing is known. That's a valid argument. If those premises are true, that conclusion has to be true. And so if it's true that knowledge can't rest on what isn't known, it requires justification, and justification is finite, then nothing is known. Essentially what Sanchez is doing is giving us Plato's puzzle that's laid out at the end of the Theaetetus, but he's affirming that conclusion, what Plato takes as a refutation of the idea that knowledge requires justification. He concludes, well, I guess we don't know what knowledge is after all. But Sanchez says, oh, I think we do know what knowledge is. The problem is nothing is known. Knowledge is impossible, and this argument proves it. That's not the only way that Sanchez puts it. But before we leave this argument and see a variant that he also stresses, I want to point out that the Pyronian can use this argument just as well. I've already mentioned that, but it's not that hard to come up with the right variant. Instead of talking about knowledge, we can just substitute reasonable belief. And same thing here on what isn't, well, reasonably believed. And we can make those substitutions throughout. Not just knowledge, but reasonable belief. Requires justification. Justification's finite. Therefore, nothing is known or nothing is reasonably believed. So although Sanchez, in the general form of modern philosophy, focuses on the question of knowledge rather than on the question of reasonable belief as the ancients tended to do, nevertheless, the form of argument he gives is one that applies just as well in that broader scenario. Here's how Sanchez justifies that first and crucial premise, that knowledge can't rest on what's unknown. He says, look, something that is not known, that knowledge rests on, is really just an assumption. It's really just a supposition. And he says, for to suppose is not to know, but to pretend. That's why from suppositions we get fictions, not knowledge. See where the arguments led us. All knowledge is fiction. And that's indeed how he puts it. If knowledge rests on what's unknown, it rests on a mere supposition, on a pretense. The conclusion is knowledge, quote unquote, is really a fiction. Nothing is known. And here's another formulation of the problem. First principles have to be supposed in every sphere of knowledge. These must not be disputed. Hence what follows from these will be supposed and not known. What could be more miserable? To know we must be ignorant, for what's supposing but admitting we don't know? Wouldn't it be better to know the first principles? I deny your first principles. Prove them. You don't have to argue against people who deny your first principles. Ha! You don't know how to prove them. You're ignorant, not knowledgeable. And so he's dismissive of those who would rest knowledge on some foundation other than knowledge. That's just mere pretense, mere supposition. But on the other hand, it's got to be, because after all, if there's such a thing as knowledge, and if knowledge requires justification, and justification can't go on forever, then actually we have to get down to something that is mere supposition. Basic problem is really one that comes out of Aristotle. Aristotle says some hold that owing to the necessity of knowing the primary premises, there is no scientific knowledge. They assume that there's no way of knowing other than by demonstration, or by justification in our terms here. They maintain that an infinite regress is involved, on the ground that if behind the prior stands no primary, we couldn't know the posterior through the prior. If they're right, it can't traverse an infinite series. If, on the other hand, the series terminates and there are primary premises, they're unknowable. They're incapable of demonstration or justification. Since one can't know the primary premises, knowledge of the conclusions that follow from them isn't pure scientific knowledge. In fact, it's not properly knowing at all. It rests on the mere supposition that the premises are true. Well, Aristotle doesn't himself take this position, but that's exactly the kind of skeptical argument that he has in mind and that he's trying to refute. He thinks, in the end, not all knowledge is demonstrative. In other words, Aristotle ends up rejecting the second premise here, that knowledge requires justification. Now, Sanchez has another sort of argument, and it's an argument about terms. It is a specifically semantic argument. In general, we've been talking about the problem of skepticism as a problem of how our mental states relate to states of the world, and that is the primary focus of the skeptic. But there is a particular form of skepticism that I call semantic skepticism. It's become increasingly important in contemporary philosophy, and Sanchez is one of the first people to focus primarily on that kind of skepticism, on semantic skepticism. He says, it's not just that we can't have knowledge because we can't justify our starting points. It's worse than that. We have no idea what we mean. We cannot explain what any word means, meaning we don't know what anything is. We don't know what justice or truth or triangularity or anything else is, because why? Well, we could construct it this way. Knowledge of meaning can't rest on what isn't known. Knowledge of meaning requires, now what? Definition. But definition has to be finite. It can't go on forever. But the problem is nothing is capable of being defined. Nothing is known. No meaning is known. Now, here is how he puts it. You say you can define a thing, like man. Not just a word. with this definition, a mortal, rational animal. I deny it, for I in turn doubt the word animal and rational and the rest. You'll go on to define these in terms of higher genera and differentiae. In other words, other kinds and ways of differentiating things within those kinds, as you call them, until you reach being. I will ask the same question about each of these. Finally, the last, being. You know nothing about what it signifies. You can't define it. It has no higher genus. You will say, I don't understand this, neither do you. You don't know what being is, even less do I. You'll nevertheless say that questions should finally be put to rest. That doesn't resolve doubt or satisfy the mind. You're forced to display your ignorance. I rejoice. Sanchez says, look, I can't know what any word even means. I can't define anything. The quest of Plato's early dialogues to give definitions of things like piety or courage or virtue or anything like that, impossible, we can't fulfill it. Why? We can't define anything. Because the moment you try to define it, you're sunk. Think about something simple like a triangle. How do you define triangle? You think, well, I know what a triangle is. Here's a good example. But now give me a definition. Well, it's a three-sided, three-angled plane figure. Define three. Define sided. Define plane figure. Well, we could try to do that, and eventually we would get back to basic terms in geometry. Euclid has a few of those, as David Hilbert, a famous mathematician writing about 100 years ago, characterized geometry. It's a slightly different set of basic things, but they involve basic concepts like point and line and being between and things of that nature. Give me definitions of point or line or being between. In the end, those have to be taken as basic. You can't give definitions of those. So, Sanchez says, you don't know what they mean. Consequently, you don't know what the words defined in terms of them mean. You don't know anything at all. We've talked about definitions in dictionaries and the idea that in the end, the dictionary just defines words in terms of other words. Sanchez, in effect, says that that's absurd, right? I try to understand what this is, I'm led to something else, I'm led to this, I'm led to that. Eventually, I'm led back around again to presupposing the meaning of the very term I set out trying to define. Can't do it. So in the end, we have no idea what anything means, even something as simple as triangle, let alone something complicated like justice or courage or virtue or friendship or love. Those things are really indefinable. And in fact, as he points out, we're led into this infinite regress, and we inevitably get back to just being a thing, to being at all. He says, we have no idea what that is, we can't possibly define that. And so in the end, all attempts to understand meaning, all attempts to know meaning, all attempts to have reasonable beliefs about meaning, or as we've seen, anything else, turn out to be impossible.